Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. School districts nationwide are facing a September 30th deadline to spend the last round of nearly $200 billion in federal COVID-19 funds on helping students recover from learning loss due to school closures and other needs. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what happens to this money on September 30th?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's kind of complicated, right? So years ago, the Congress, the Biden administration, they worked together to create like this, relief package for schools across the country to address, as you mentioned, the COVID learning loss, right? The students who are not performing as they should have been. Maybe we could start seeing that because of test scores pretty immediately. That, there was a lot of declines in academic performance. So this was supposed to be targeted to bolster, the amount of time that students were getting with tutors and, that in-person academic help, right, to bridge that gap and get those test scores up. And so on September 30th, that's the last day that school districts can obligate school funds with this specific program. So like essentially when I say specific program is like there's 3 different rounds of school relief as far as like there was different kinds of bills that Congress enacted that would send money to school districts. And so the American Rescue Plan had what was called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. And these are the kinds of names that sort of the bureaucracy machine comes up with, I think. It's not very wieldy, but people just call it ESSER. So that's the ESSER funds. So it's American Rescue Plan, ARP, ESSER, and this is the 3rd installment, and this is the largest installment. So out of almost $190 billion of relief to school districts, the ARP ESSER, the 3rd ARP ESSER 3, so it sounds kind of like we're introducing like, a very regal descendant, the ARP ESSER the 3rd. It made up $120 billion of that, almost 190. So this was the most substantial portion, right? And so that's kind of the biggest challenge. And if you kind of think about this way, like money is good, right? You want money for your school district. And, if it's going to happen anyway, you want to get, what was allotted to you from the federal government to help your, students with academic improvement or with infrastructure. So these kinds of things, like maybe a once in a lifetime amount of influx of cash from Congress with the federal coffers. But then it's sort of, you're looking at it and you're like, okay, this is actually kind of a challenge because there's so much money that has to be obligated in certain ways. There's the administrative burden of that money, right? That's weighing down on you. And so, and some school districts didn't make it with that ARP ESSER 2, like that second round of funding, which was not as large, right? There were some school districts that did not allot portions of that. And so that went back to the Treasury. And that's what's going to happen to specific school districts if they don't allot that or obligate that funding in that time frame by September 30th. Like that money will go back to the Treasury. So it's kind of a long answer. It's also kind of complicated. I'm going to keep going a little bit longer here. It's also a little bit complicated because some states have applied for a waiver to that for that September 30th deadline, and I think have gotten it. And then other states are not doing that. And I think that, maybe they have a bent against the federal government. They're more into federalism. They're saying we're not gonna extend the deadline, so schools have to, get this to us. And it seems, this is quite a bit delayed from when the bill was first implemented, right? So it's kind of a case by case basis depending on what kinds of obligation. I think there's also some loopholes there for labor. Even if you get an extension, you can't pay somebody, to be in the classroom or like after school help. Like you cannot use it for labor. So there are like specific deadlines with specific kinds of obligations. And again, we're getting into, these big acts of Congress that are very, unwieldy, with unwieldy names and some of these unwieldy obligations. And I think that in these situations, you can kind of be glad that you're not the administrator who's in charge of this for like a large school district, right? It's very complicated and it's a big task to try to think about, okay, what are the district's needs and how do I spend this money in compliance with federal law? Because there's always strings attached if it's coming from the federal government. How do we spend this money and do it in the time frame? And, it's going to take board approval. So people really have to kind of coalesce around the spending goals, right?
So do we have any sense of how much money districts have left over at this point?
Yeah. So according to the Department of Education spending tracker, we do have an idea of, how much how much states have basically, like, it's not school districts, but it's states and how they're doing on their allocation of the American Rescue Plan funds, those ESSER 3 funds. And Washington, D.C. is coming in dead last in terms of the amount that it has allocated, right? It's got 44% of the ARP ESSER 3 spending allocated. So, it has just a few weeks left. That's a long way to go to try to bridge that gap. And then behind Washington, D.C., Nebraska reported spending 56% of its ESSER 3 funds as of July 1st, and Maryland spent about 60% of its ESSER funds, leaving that remaining 40%, according to the Department of Education. So in terms of the timeline there, July 1st, it can seem like a long time ago, but I think in terms of like looking at federal spending, that's actually pretty recent, but it's not necessarily a clear picture of like how much do they actually have. It's because the latest we have is of July 1st. And that they could have, like, school districts can go to their state. It's called the State Education Agency, and, the State Department of Education, and say, here's this, and then the state will approve it, but has not yet sent it to the federal government. So that can sometimes, there can be a discrepancy between those two. So I think that kind of shows some, as of July 1st, there were some places, and then again, that's coming in close after having this for years, right? That there are some places coming in close, and, the crunch is on.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.